This is Nicole, who took Effexor and tried to kill herself. And then, because she wanted to help other young people who were taking antidepressants, she agreed to be interviewed for a film that was called Comfortably Numb. So what I would like to do briefly with you today, because that industry infiltration into science and research in the U.S. is a huge problem, I want you to keep in mind that pharmaceutical companies in the United States spend more money on marketing than they do on research and development, and that they spend $10,000 per year per physician on specific marketing to physicians, and that they fund a lobbyist for each member of our Congress, a full-time lobbyist for each member of Congress. That's how powerful they are. So because of this infiltration into science, we need to look at the clinical trial data ourselves to draw our own conclusions and not rely on pharmaceutical reps to tell us what the data actually mean. And I want to go through some of the flaws of research that I'd like for you to look for as you read these actual clinical trials yourself, which is what I'm hoping that you will take on. First is a compromised blind. You all know that the randomized clinical trial at its foundation depends upon the person who's giving the drug not knowing what they're giving and the person receiving the drug not knowing what they're receiving. That is a fundamental component of all randomized clinical trials. But when inactive placebos are utilized as a comparison drug, when they are not psychoactive placebos, everyone knows very quickly who's taking the actual drug and who isn't taking the actual drug. So none of these studies are actually unblinded because patients know they're not receiving the drug because there are no side effects, and the clinician raters know that they're not receiving the drug because there's no side effects. So the blinds are compromised. The next flaw to look for is whether or not they are clinician-rated or patient-rated measures of outcome. Next slide, please. And traditionally, drug research uses clinician-rated measures, and that's fine. However, how much progress is there really if the patient is not recording it as well? And if you'll look at clinical trial data, you'll find that more often than not, 99 times out of 100, patient-rated measures of outcomes show no difference with placebo. So they're only rating different by clinician, not by the patients themselves. There are ways to know these things in your practice. There are available measures to measure easily client response to medication, and you can also check those out on my website. Next slide, please. Time of measurement is another flaw. You know that most clinical trials are run 8 to 12 weeks, but none of these drugs are ever prescribed for 8 to 12 weeks. So you have to wonder, is this a logistic of the study or is it an intentional strategic device? Because we know that differences between drugs and placebos tend to minimize the longer the time goes on, and most will wash out altogether. So time of measurement is a very important consideration, and looking for how drugs do in the long run makes more sense for actual clinical practice. Conflicts of interest. This is a big thing to consider when you're reading a study. Who is paying for the study, and are the authors financially related with the drug that's under concern? And in fact, this is a rampant problem in the United States. Not only the drug companies fund the research, actual researchers may work for the companies that are actually doing the study, which certainly compromises their scientific objectivity about whatever it is they're happening to be looking at. And in fact, there was a public funded research that looked at 10 antipsychotic trials, and they were comparing the different antipsychotics. And in 9 of the 10 trials, the company that funded the study, their drug came out on top, to give you an idea of how this translates. And finally, the final flaw, and perhaps the most important, next slide please, is the minimization of risks. I don't know how many drug studies you've read, but I've read many of them, and they often conclude that the drug is safe and well tolerated and effective. But when you look in the study itself, you find that that's not actually true at all, that it's not well tolerated because the side effects or the adverse events are not reported in tabular form. They're often in footnotes, they're in text that's not easy to discern, so they tend to minimize the risks that go along with the drugs, and it takes actually looking for those risks to be able to make any sense of that. So just to give you an exercise in how you may do this, I want to present one study to you very briefly. And this is the treatment of adolescent depression study. A very famous study in the United States, was heralded as the be-all and end-all that would finally address the question of safety of antidepressants for children. It was a large clinical trial. You see the number there, 432 adolescents. It compared Prozac, an antidepressant, to placebo, to cognitive behavioral therapy, to a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and medication. So here's what the media reported. And I want to call your attention to one part here. And that is, the take-home message is that medication works, that suicide risk is minimal, and that the positive effects of medicine outweigh the risk. Now, in the United States, press releases are often written by pharmaceutical companies and distributed to the media, and this is one example of that. Now, after you look at that conclusion, I would like for you to see what the data actually say. So if we look at flaw number one, actually there wasn't a placebo control group for the combination group, but there was an inactive placebo. Was the first flaw that we look at there. So everyone kind of knew what group they were in, as well as the clinician raters. If we look at the measures themselves, no patient-rated measure by the child or the adult showed any difference to placebo. No patient-rated measure. And the primary measures were not only were they clinician-rated, the primary clinician-rated measure showed no difference either. Only the secondary clinician-rated measure showed a difference. Third, time of measurement. If we look at 36 weeks, there was no difference at all between any of the conditions. All the differences between the conditions fell out by the 36th week. And if we look at conflicts of interest, the primary investigator, the study was funded by Eli Lilly, the primary investigator. John Marsh is on the Speakers Bureau. He holds stock in Eli Lilly, as did several other of the people that were involved in the study. You'd have to question their objectivity on that basis alone. And then finally, the one that gets me the most about this study is the minimization of the risk. If you recall, the conclusion was that antidepressants were safe and effective. There were 6 times the rate of suicidal behavior in the antidepressants groups to the placebo or therapy groups. 6 times the rate of suicidal behavior. So, what conclusions do we draw from this? Well, I hope one conclusion that you draw is that we can't trust media interpretations of the data. We certainly can't trust pharmaceutical industry's interpretation of the data. We can trust our own interpretation of the data. We need to look at it ourselves, and that's what I'm asking you here to do today. I'm not asking you to stop your prescription of psychiatric drugs. I'm asking you to understand the risks and benefits that go along with that, to look at the data yourself. And as a frontline practitioner, if you are, it's a big burden of responsibility to do that, but you may need only to be able to trust your own look at the data in this. And in a larger way of thinking about this, if we look at the power of the pharmaceuticals, I really only know of one power on earth, and that is the church, that has any chance of standing up to that kind of influence. The influence of greed and the influence of taking advantage of folks that don't have a voice for their own.